You may always ask yourself, who are you? Or who am I? And when we ask that question, how will we answer it? And maybe we can also ask other questions like, where does my identity come from? How did I become who I am today? And what are the factors that affect my identity or who I am today? Or is my identity the same as before? Or has my identity changed throughout time? So here in this lecture video, we will talk about communication and identity construction. We will look at how communication plays a huge role in shaping our identity and how our identity also shapes how we communicate and interact with other people. And we will also look and also establish here that identity is a social process, and it is a social process rather than an outcome that we communicate to others. So here we can see that that because communication is dynamic, our identity is also dynamic. So our agenda for this lecture is that first we will explain the process of identity construction in and through communication. And the next is to analyze issues in the construction of personal and collective identities using concepts from the communication theory of identity, which we will learn later, positioning theory, and other related perspectives. So we need to define first identity. Identity is the everyday word for people's sense of who they are. It is the perception of yourself to yourself and the perception of others to you. And basically, it is having the sense of who we are. Uh, it is having the sense of who we are. And this sense of who we are is formed through our interactions with others. So we always need to take note that when we are talking about identity, it's not just about your perception about yourself, it is also the perception of other people about you. It is also uh, the identity that others see that you may not see, or others see that you also see to yourself. So here, as we continue to interact with other people, as we continue to communicate and practice communication, we also come to uh, we also come to know who we are, and not just to know other people, but we also realize who we are. And here we also need to take note that identities are not stable or static or even unitary, but it continues to change. It is dynamic and it continues to change and present multiple identities depending on the interaction and situation. So, for example, you may present yourself, a version of yourself, to your family, but it may be different or slightly different when you present yourself to your friends, or when you present yourself in this class. It would be different when you present yourselves to other classes. So here it depends on the interaction and the situation. So in other words, our identity is actually fluid, and it is shaped by our interactions and surroundings. So we will look at the communication theory of identity by Hecht and Jung. And they have these key tenets or key concepts on the communication theory of identity. First of all, identity is a social process. So whenever we develop or establish an identity, it always involves the process of socialization or communication with others or interaction with other people. Next is identity is constructed in and through communication. So here you cannot be able to develop an identity, you won't be able to or even establish or even improve who you are without the use of communication. And also, we use communication to name, describe, and also to assign characteristics, not just to yourself, but also to others as well. We use communication to even create stereotypes. We also use communication to describe someone. And the last one is that communication defines us when we internalize judgments of ourselves, others, and social groups based on our way of expressing ourselves. So here when we try to look at others, when we try to describe the identity of other people, we try to look it on our own eyes. We try to describe it on our own expression. And that means at the same time, we also try to, when we try to look at ourselves, when we try to look at our own identity, it is we try to look it by asking others, what do you think about me? Who do you think I am? So it's like a looking glass self, but at the same time, the mirror is not a physical mirror, but the mirror is based on the perceptions of others, and it's also adding up to your own perception. So that those are the key concepts of the communication theory of identity. So as we continue to understand more about this theory, we would also look at some of the frames or loci of identity. And these are personal, enacted, relational, and finally communal. So these frames of identity will actually help us understand how our identity is multifaceted and are based and how our identity is based on social interactions. So let's try to look at them one by one. First, we go to the personal frame. So personal frame include self-cognition. So this includes your self-image, your self-concept, or how you actually see yourself, or uh, how or what do you think you are to others or even to yourself. Who do you think you are? So, all personal dispositional characteristics that help us to make sense of who we are belong to this frame. So, this is more of how you define yourself, how you describe yourself. The next is the enacted frame. So the enacted frame is more on performativity. It's more on how you, it's more on our outward expressions of ourselves or the performance and outward expressions of our identity. So here, our identity is framed or is based on how we formulate messages to express our identity. So those things belong in that frame, in the enacted identity. So anything that you do, any maybe people would identify you based on your mannerisms or based on uh, your tone or based on what you do in life. So those belong in the enacted frame of identity. The third one is the relational frame. And it explains identity as something that is embedded in our relationships with others. So in this frame, we we now look at how we form our relationships with other people. So people would say that maybe maybe you don't I don't know, maybe you don't interact with others. Maybe you're just a shy type, or maybe you are a people person. You hang out well with other people. Maybe you're a party person. So those things belong in the relational frame. How people see you in terms of relationships. So in the enacted identity, how people or your identity that is based on how you present yourselves using outward expressions, the personal frame of identity is more on how you define yourself. And finally, in the communal frame, uh, here identities become a shared vision of personhood for a collective. So in this process, the identities are ascribed and to through relationships. So here, it's also relational. It's also similar to the relational frame of identity, but at the same time, here you identify yourself as a collective. How you see yourself is based on the group that you belong to. Maybe you are part of an indigenous people group and their culture, um, which is also a part of their identity, has also become your identity. It has become a collective or a shared identity. So here we also need to take note that these are some of the frames of identity, and uh, we our identities may differ or may vary depending on which frame we will look at. So these are what we call identity gap, where there are discrepancies among the four frames of identity. And that means, in other words, your identity is not as consistent. Maybe it differs, but it is not, but it can also be consistent. But here, when we have identity gap, when there are discrepancies among the frames of identity, um, that means that our identity is not consistent with one another, even though it varies. So, in order to have a consistent identity and also to address identity gaps, we need to have the following communication outcomes. The first one is communication satisfaction. The next one is to feel understood whenever we are communicating with one another, and also to achieve conversational appropriateness and effectiveness. Usually, this is a common problem or issue among intercultural students, where if you are or someone is an exchange student, they may not be able to understand um, to understand to understand you as you communicate as they communicate with you, or they may not feel satisfied on their communication or interaction, or sometimes we may say something that is insensitive to them. So here, it also those things, those issues contribute to the widening of the identity gap. But in order to address identity gap, we need to be able to be to be competent when it comes to communicating with others. We need to be aware of the identity of the person. We need to be aware of the context or the culture of the person, and we need to be able to make and create appropriate and effective messages or conversations in order for them to feel understood and also to feel satisfied whenever they're communicating. So our goal here is that these frames of identity must be consistent with one another to avoid identity gaps, and so that we would be able to have a coherent identity, and at the same time we would be able to present ourselves in a much clearer way. So according to Hecht and Choi, they said that from social identity theory, CTI, which is the communication theory of identity, draws on the notion that identity is based on social categorization and shared group memberships. Societal norms and practices are internalized in the form of social identities based on social categories, especially in in group or in out group uh, distinctions. So what they're saying here is that according to the communication theory of identity, not only our identity is constructed in the process of interacting with others, but identity is also a collective or group quality. So that means that it is not actually an individual. perspective, it always our identity is always contributed not just by our own perceptions or by our own actions, but our identity is actually produced or is contributed by group by our collective identity. That means our surroundings affect who we are, or our surroundings shape who we are. The people and the surroundings, um, and the people and the environment that surround us affect our our identity. So when we talk about collective identities, we actually include racial and ethnic identity. So this means you identify yourselves with an indigenous people or a certain people group. So or a certain ethnicity. So here, this affects your identity as well. Uh, another collective identity that we can consider is is a national identity. So here we consider ourselves as Filipinos, and when we have a national identity, we look at um, our state as one people, or we look at who we are as a nation. Next is also having a religious identity. Here you identify yourselves as a part of a religious group, and your actions, your words, and even how you present yourselves is maybe based on your religion. So you may say that, oh, I'm a Christian, and because I'm a Christian, I am doing values that are related to Christianity, and because of that, uh, your values shape who you are and what you do. And finally, you also have the organizational identity. So if you belong to a student organization, that most likely the organization's culture also affects your identity as well, and affects who you are, how you act, and maybe you are also like one of the of your org mates. So sometimes when you do something or when you say something, people would be able to identify you. Oh, you come from this org, or oh, I think you are from this kind of organization because they always say this, they always do this, and because of that, it's also embedded to your actions. It's also embedded to your values as well, and these collective identities actually shape who you are, or maybe even comprise of majority of who you are or how you present yourselves to others and to yourself as well. And when we actually talk about collective identities, we also deal with the what we call intersectionality. So here, when we talk about intersectionality, we always look uh, at how our identities, our collective identities, intersect with one another, and how uh, it affect it affects our life as well. So when we talk about intersectionality, we deal with three things: race or ethnicity. Next is class, and finally gender. So race or ethnicity, class, and gender shape and produce social identities, and 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 through that it also reflects privilege or oppression. So we try to look at some examples in the Philippine setting. One example is being a gay parlor person. So when we talk about the LGBT community in the Philippines, almost all of them are discriminated by a lot of people. And because they are discriminated by a lot of people, they have less opportunities in life because they belong in the LGBTQ community. And because of that, uh, they try to look for work that will help them to have more opportunities. So they are not only dealing with their gender, but they are also dealing with class. They are also, and maybe so some of the identities is that maybe you're a gay parlor person, but you are also a gay parlor indigenous person as well, and it affects maybe your it may reflect their oppression or or the discrimination against them. But what if you're a white guy? But what if you are a white rich guy? So here, you you are a white or rich straight guy. That means it also reflects your privilege. You are more privileged than those who are in the marginalized sector. When it comes to ethnicity, when it comes to class, when it comes to gender. So here, intersectionality actually heightens or even intensifies the privilege or oppression of a certain person. And intersectionality actually deal with social or collective identities. Next is that our collective identities are shaped by power as well, or power dynamics in society. So here we look at our identities as power relations. So when we try to identify ourselves, we also ask ourselves, are we in the top of the food chain? Are we in the bottom of the food chain? Or how intersectionality affects our power dynamics? Um, are we in the privileged side? Are we in the oppressed side? And because of that, do we actually have a voice? Do we actually have a power to change things? And because of that, we also show our power through different narratives, through communication, and and because we can show it through communication, whenever we have an opportunity to voice out who we are and to challenge the status quo or the social norms that we currently live in, whenever we have that voice, we can actually change something to these narratives. That is why narratives are important when it comes to hearing the stories of change or even in rhetoric. We always use narratives. We always use the stories of different people with different social and collective identities in order to challenge the the status quo or the current norms of society, and we would and as we challenge power dynamics, as we challenge the current norms, we are also able to heighten or even to uh, to create power relations on our identities, to empower us, to empower who we are, and not just ourselves, but also those who identify the same with us. So here we also deal with because of the power relations, we also deal with positioning, which is a process where people position themselves in different discursive or uh, conversational locations that change different storylines. So this is what I am talking about. We use narratives to position ourselves to challenge the current who is on top, to challenge the food chain or or the pyramid, and be able to topple down what is the current or what who holds the power. So in other words, people can actually use their narratives, and when they have an opportunity to voice out or to share their narratives, we we use those narratives to change the status quo or change power dynamics or even express their self-determination as a collective. And because of that, we are able to change uh, the power relations behind our identities or intersectionality behind our identities. So instead of ha- having an identity of oppression, we may actually have the identity of equality or having the identity of privilege because of how we position ourselves, how we how we how we use our narratives to change, to create change, or to persuade people, or even to change the discourse, or even to or even to change the conversations about our identities. So, in this module, we have explored the dynamics between identity and communication as elucidated in the communication theory of identity and also in the positioning theory. So, a key point is made that identities are not just singular, are not just unitary, and are not just a static, but identities are multiple, and that they do not function in total isolation from each other. As we look at the frames or loci of identity, we actually have different frames of identity, and we have different versions of ourselves depending on the context, depending on the situation or the interaction, or who are we interacting with. So when we acknowledge the multiplicity of identities, we can avoid drawing hasty generalizations about people, or what we call, or in other words, stereotypes. So here we are not, when we look at, when the next time we look at ourselves, the next time we look at others, we don't just judge them because of what we see, or what they do, or who they are physically. But here we need to do a deeper understanding of who they are, and to have and to know them more. We need to communicate with them so that we would be able to have the right perception about who they are, and be able to understand how dynamic their identity and your identity and our identities are. And because of stereotypes, it results to discrimination, microaggressions, and also group conflict or collective conflict. And because we are able to become more aware, and we acknowledge that identities are that there are multiple identities, there are different versions of who we are able to avoid these kinds of actions, discrimination, and microaggressions, and intergroup conflict. So instead, our judgments and our judgments of people are based on a balanced and wide understanding of our respective contexts and personalities. So secondly, if our identities or if if identities are a relational phenomenon, we would we would do well to refrain from oversimplifying them. So we are not just looking at them based on what we see, but we are also encouraged to talk to them, to interact with them, to practice our communication skills in order to get to know them, and not just be judgmental on looking at them, or even looking at ourselves as just one simple identity, because identities are complex. And and that means that as we continue to acknowledge that identities are a complex thing, and that we would be able to get to know not just ourselves but also other people through communication, we are refraining ourselves from oversimplifying ourselves as a revolving around a unitary axis of similarity and difference. So according to Joseph, identity is an intersubjective construction emerging from overlapping and complementary relationships characterized by, but not exclusive to, similarity and difference, genuineness and artifice, and authority and delegitimacy. This perspective in turn should enable us to give space for others to negotiate their identities as we negotiate ours. So we have to remember here that our identities are work in progress. We may not be able to understand who we are today. For some of you, you may be able to understand yourself well, or some of you may still be confused on who you are. But but there is no worry to that because it is a continuing process. Our identities change from time to time. And what we need to do is to create a genuine version of who we are, is to discover who we really are, and to develop that into in, into a person that is genuine, that is consistent, and at the same time that is you. You are that is you. That means your identity is not based on others, but it is based on who you really are, who you really think you are, or how people think you are, based on how you present yourself to them.